welcome back, everybody. Welcome to Cinemacast, our movie review podcast right here on our channel, Arrow Entertainment on YouTube. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button down below if you enjoy our content. Also, if you are into our gameplay streams and our podcasts over on our streaming channels, Twitch and Kick, be sure to follow us over there as well. And if you are on Discord and you want to keep up to date with us on the latest with gaming news, podcasting, anime, anything of that such, if you're on Discord, link for that is down below with everything else. Come join us today. So, today's feature. This is a doozy. And I recently watched this. This is from IFC Films and distributed by Shudder as well. This movie came out in the Sundance Film Festival January 24th of this year, and it released in the United States May 31st. This is an interesting Canadian slasher called Any Violent Nature. And what turned me on to this film was two things. One, people were talking about how this movie seemed to be very, very violent and grotesque for those who saw it in theaters. Mind you, there are so many slasher films out there that have come out in the last, 60 years, since the 1960s, that have shocked audiences worldwide. And people think that this particular film shocked them. No, I've seen much, much more grotesque than this. And I'm a horror fan. I like slashers. I've seen some bad slashers. I've seen slashers where I'm just like, what the hell am I watching? There's even slashers starring Kane Hodder, who was Jason for 4 of the main roles of Friday the 13th series. Kane Hodder was in those movies. Hatchet. Now, if you want grotesque, violent, something that you probably vomit at if you're very squeamish, yeah, those movies. This movie doesn't compare to movies like that. Yeah, but this movie does have a particular take to it. This was written and directed by Chris Nash, and it stars Rye Barrett, Andrea Pavlik, and Lauren Marie Taylor. This is a Canadian slasher, so it's not made in the United States, not Australian or anything, which I would have figured, a movie like this has to be outside the U.S. Usually, like, movies filmed in Australia or somewhere over in Europe, especially Japanese horror movies, they tend to have much more of a deeper scare and a darker tone to them than they do over here in America. Because over here in America, we used to make good horror movies. We used to have good horror movies, but now it's like Hollywood has ran out of so many ideas, and now we're relying on indie films and films that are made in other countries, like this one. And this premiered, like I said, January 22nd. I hope I didn't say 20. Okay, released in January 24th. They must have got a typo on this. But it released at the Sundance Film Festival as part of the festival's midnight program, and it was theatrically released in the U.S. and in Canada by IFC Films May 31st. Now, what's very particular about this film? It's an ambient slasher, which follows a mute killer who is accidentally resurrected from his grave in the Ontario wilderness by a group of teenagers whom he then begins stalking and murdering. The events depicted are largely observed from the killer's perspective. Let's just say, if you watch Friday the 13th, okay, you watch it from where you see the victims. Okay, you see the innocent victims, the bystanders who show up at the camp. They're there for a weekend or a week of fun, swimming around, pranking each other, playing games and such. And then you got this mysterious killer out there. Well, in the first one it was mysterious, but after that you knew exactly who the hell it was. He stalks these victims and he kills them in grotesque ways. So you're following it as like a movie. Well, imagine if you watched You knew what he looked like. He wore the iconic hockey mask from the third one on up. And let's just say that that's what the camera perspective was. Even if you didn't have the music, the iconic music in the movie, you just followed Jason around the woods. You followed him where he was going from one point to another, even if he walked underwater. You'd be following Jason the whole time around. That's basically what this movie is. And to spoil it just a little bit, to give you guys an insider of how it begins. Now, if you have not seen this movie yet, go check it out. Go watch it and then come back. I tell everybody who watches these reviews, there are going to be spoilers. So if you don't want to be spoiled, if you don't want to know anything about it, go check it out first and then come back. So the movie basically starts out, the camera is on this grave site. It just focused on this grave site. You know something's going to happen, and you hear these people. You hear these people in the background saying something. So a group of friends discover a locket hanging on the remains of a fire tower. One of them, named Troy, pockets it. Moments later, the corpse of Johnny, who is our titular character, the antagonist, rises from the ground. Enraged, he begins his search for the locket and walks through the woods. So that is basically the synopsis for the start of the movie. Now, about halfway through the movie, now this movie is only 94 minutes long, which is a typical runtime for a lot of traditional horror films from back in the 80s and the 90s and such. Sometimes I feel like it's not long enough to explain a lot of detail, but with a movie like this, there's really not a whole lot to even really explain. Like, for instance, there is a scene within the movie where this group of friends meet up at a campfire one night, and one of them ends up telling a story about this guy, Johnny, who is our titular character, our antagonist, and what happened to him. So there is a motive, there is a drive to this character. And as I explained, one of these friends ends up taking this locket, which apparently, I believe it belonged to his mother, and it was there to basically keep Johnny at rest at his grave. And then they took it, and that's where he arose. Whereas if you watch a movie like Friday the 13th, there's a reason why Jason ended up killing camp counselors every movie that came along. The first movie it was Jason's mother who ended up doing the killing, because camp counselors failed to watch her son. Her son drowned in the lake. The camp counselors, they all failed to watch him. Kids were picking on him because of his disformity and that he was mentally retarded. So yeah, there was a reason why Jason's mom did what she did, and then when she ended up getting killed off, Jason, of course, comes back to life somehow. I don't know. He drowned in the lake as a kid, and now as a corpse, he comes back. Nobody will ever know how or why he came back to life, but he did. And each movie, he went on a killing spree, killing off all these camp counselors and teenagers that, basically invade his home, the woods. And luckily enough, he never did any harm to any children. There is, I think it was part 6, there was a lot of children that were camping out at the campsite, but Jason, he only scared them a little bit. He never did any harm to any children, which was good. But he was always after the adults, the teenagers, the camp counselors, basically. So in this movie here, this guy, he's only after a certain group of kids, and he'll kill off anybody else who gets in his way. And that's how Jason was in Friday the 13th. If he wasn't after a particular group of people, he would kill off anybody in his way. That's what happens in these slashers, in these movies there, where you have a slasher and you have a motive. This killer's motive here, Johnny, somebody took his mother's locket that had him at rest. And he wasn't going to rest until he got that locket back. So, throughout the movie, for about, I want to say, about 89 minutes. For about 89 minutes. Now, there's about 85 to 89 minutes where you do follow this character, Johnny. You follow his perspective. Whether it be third person, behind his shoulder, behind his back, walking around. You do get to see his face at times. You see what he's doing. And there is a particular scene toward the end of the movie where you presume that Johnny was killed off or just walked off, or you expect him to jump out from somewhere. But no, it's just from the perspective of somebody else. But yeah, there is a particular scene toward the end, like I said, spoilers, where one of the characters who does survive, she has possession of the locket, the necklace, where she ends up leaving on top of a gas canister while Johnny is brutally stabbing this one guy continuously. And it is just hilarious of how he does it. You know, he ends up driving a meat cleaver through his head, and he's constantly hacking away at his body the whole time while this girl is just standing there watching it. And when she knows that she can't go, you know, she's not going to be able to defeat this guy, she just puts his gas canister down, sets the necklace down because she figures this is what he wants. And then she runs. And she manages to get away. She catches up with somebody. You know, she's bleeding out. And that's like the last 5 minutes of the movie. You don't see the creature, you don't see the slasher, you don't see the creature or anything for the rest of the movie. Now, however, the last scene, the very last scene after all of that, pans back to that gas canister and you see the necklace gone. So, which means Johnny is now laid back to rest. All is well within the movie. But what I feel like, aside from the story, I feel like what makes it entirely interesting to me is the fact of you follow Johnny's every path in the movie. Even when he's stalking a couple girls at a lake, and rather than walk around the woods, like you see him walking into the lake and you almost kind of follow him. You follow him under the water and such until he gets to the other side and makes his next kill. But like I said, this is basically like this is kind of like a rip-off of Friday the 13th in a sense. It's almost like a rip-off of Friday the 13th where, you know, you got the villain, you know, the whole setting is a campsite. You have this unknown killer who's unknown to everybody else. You got a group of friends that are staying there. Of course, you got to have a scene where the girls are out on the lake sunbathing or swimming naked in the lake or whatever. You got a campfire where everybody's huddled around and telling stories and such. And they're staying in the cabin, and each person dies off one by one. And then the next day they find, oh, so-and-so never came back. We got to go out and look for him and all. You know, so it's almost like the plot line, the build-up, the whole story structure is kind of mimicking, in a sense, to Friday the 13th, but it's not. It's its own entity. But what makes it entirely different than those movies is the fact, like I said, this movie is from the killer's perspective. You follow this guy around in the woods. Like, if he's in one spot and he's got to catch up with his target in the next spot, you literally watch him turn around, walk through these woods. He doesn't run. He doesn't teleport. He doesn't really power walk like Jason does, but he just walks. And he knows the woods very well. He will walk from one point to another, and he will catch his target, you know, without hesitation. That's what makes this movie so fun and interesting. Now, I did catch myself kind of falling asleep on it for a couple times, but not too much. And I will say, this movie is probably not for everyone because of the fact that you are following the killer's perspective the entire time, especially walking through the woods. And that can be such a bore fest within itself because you're watching him, he's walking and walking. And then there's times where he stops to do something, but then he gets up and he walks some more. So it's almost like, yeah, like I said, this is if Friday the 13th was boring to a lot of people. Now, on a critic's response, okay, now, Rotten Tomatoes, of course, they give it a 78%. And it also stated the website's consensus reads as a single-mindedly focused on mayhem as its demonic monster in a violent nature serves up a deliciously disgusting feast for gore. I don't even know how to pronounce that word, but I will say it's not as disgusting. I've seen much worse when it comes to horror movies, when it comes to slashers. I've seen a lot more gore. I've seen a lot more inventive kills when it comes to slashers. Variety's Dennis Harvey wrote that the film's stripped-down approach to the familiar gist has a distinctiveness that is impressive, and it's sure to please fans who are always up for a new slasher film, but wish most of them weren't so interchangeable. Cheryl Eady of Gizmodo called it a fascinating artistic experiment, and genre fans should definitely give it a look. But it may also make you wish you were watching a traditional slasher for something more fun and entertaining. Maybe suggest Friday the 13th Part 2 instead. So there you got somebody who's actually comparing it to what I've been explaining as Friday the 13th, you know? But that's the whole thing with this movie. It's almost like a... Now this person here, okay, let me read this. As of June 20th, Variety ranked this movie the best horror movie of the year so far, with writer William Earle noting, amid the outrageous kills and crisp camera work lies a sharp satire laced with empathy, beauty, and genuine fear. Now, fear, I wouldn't pretty much call it that. Fear would be if you focused on the victims, if you sympathize with the victims and who gets killed off next, how they get killed off and such. If there's a particular character that you have a likeness for and you don't want to see anything happen to them. This movie, however, it's a horror movie buff's enjoyment ride. This is their popcorn flick right here. Like, if you want a movie, a slasher movie where you're rooting for the killer, where you're rooting for the slasher, this is your movie right here. How many fans up there root for Jason every time Jason kills somebody, and in a very grotesque way? You know, that's all people want to see. They want to see Freddy Krueger kill. They want to see Michael Myers or Leatherface or Freddy Krueger or anybody of that nature. You want to see your favorite slasher monster, your horror movie monster, just kill in particular ways. That's why people usually come back for the Saw movies. And there's like 11 Saw movies out there. And you basically come back for the kills. You come back for the traps set up. You don't care too much for the story. Like, the story is very convoluted throughout a series of movies, but you just come back for the gore. You come back for the kills. It's very interesting in every take. I think that's when it comes to a horror movie or a slasher movie, that's like the one thing that really drives its fan base, its audience, is the violent nature of each film. It's not really about the plot. It's not mostly about the plot. Like, you have a plot there, but for the most part, people don't really focus on the story or the plot. They focus on what is going on and how it's happening. And I think that's what's going on with a movie like this. And as this person from Variety stated, you know, it's a sharp satire. Yeah, it's a satire to the whole slasher genre, especially movies like Friday the 13th. And I think that's what people love about this movie, is it feels like a Friday the 13th movie, but in a twist, where you follow the killer around, you know what's going to happen, you know he's going to kill him, and in what particular way. Now, there's a couple scenes in the movie that are pretty comical, even though they're not supposed to be comical, but I found myself laughing at one of the scenes where one of the friends gets killed off, and it's just so hilarious in how it happens. It happens just like that. And I'm not going to spoil it for you guys, but let's just say I'm pretty sure if you go to see it, you'll know what I'm talking about, and you will give the same reaction that I did for this movie. But I will say, this movie, it's not for everybody. It's for people who are fans of the subgenre, the slasher genre, which has been around since the 1960s. You know, Psycho was one of the first slasher horror films, you know, brilliantly done by, you know, Alfred Hitchcock. And it just goes down along the line of different slasher movies throughout many decades. You know, Halloween brought it to, you know, it just brought it out into the open. You know, it just made it more mainstream. Halloween, movies like Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, even though they were kind of underground for its time, but they brought everything so mainstream, and people were wanting more and more slasher movies. Now, Halloween wasn't the first slasher movie. There were others well before that, but it was the first one that took place on a holiday night, and it gave a reason, you know, for its killer and all, and it just made it more so mainstream. It was one of the most terrifying horror movies of all time, and still one of the best loved horror movies of all time, and it still is to this day. And then you got movies like Friday the 13th. You got the boogeyman in the hockey mask. Nightmare on Elm Street. You got the boogeyman that stalks you in your sleep, kills you in your sleep. Every horror movie or every slasher movie has a particular killer in its own way, and they do what they do for a reason. Michael Myers, he killed his sister when he was a child. You know, he was later on, depending on the timeline you follow for Halloween, you know, he was cursed. You know, he was cursed or he was possessed or something, whatever. Friday the 13th, you know, Jason apparently witnessed the death of his mother, and he avenged his mother in several movies. Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy Krueger, he was a child, he was a pedophile and a child murderer. He was burned in his house alive by the parents of the Elm Street kids. So he came back and stalked, you know, their future's children in their dreams. So each horror movie usually has a particular premise for each character. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, really no motive. It's just a fucked up family in the middle of nowhere. You know, you got a family that's all real fucked up. They got that one character that wears his victims' skin faces on his head. You know, and chases people around with a chainsaw. Whereas the motive for this killer in this movie, in A Violent Nature, he's laid to rest by his mother's locket, his mother's necklace. Somebody takes it, and he's up and about looking for it and killing anybody who invades his woods. All he wants to do is sleep in peace, be buried in peace. But this group of friends decide to come by. Oh, look, I'm going to take that. Let's go start a fire somewhere and enjoy our weekend. No, your weekend's going to be pretty much ruined at this point. But this movie, like I said, it's not for everybody. If you are interested in checking it out, I will say you're probably in for a treat. Me, I did enjoy it. Like I said, I fell asleep during parts of it, you know, because you're just watching the killer walk through the woods. You know, that's probably the most boring part of the movie, but you're always waiting for something else to happen, especially like the last 5 minutes of the movie. You're waiting for something to happen. And you're like on the edge of your seat, like, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Something's going to happen. He's going to pop out, whatever, you know. But this is something for fans who definitely enjoy slasher movies. You probably will enjoy this. My rating on this movie, I would definitely give it a 6.5 out of 10. That's pretty fair for what I can give it right now. I only watched it once. And I don't know if I'll go back and watch it again. I may watch it again, but if you guys if you are fans and you truly love and support the subgenre, the slasher film, you know, the slasher horrors, you probably will give this a little bit better rating. But my rating for this movie is going to be 6.5 out of 10. Everybody else will vary different. I'm not going to say this movie is horrible, it's bad. I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to say it's a masterpiece, even though some people will say it's a masterpiece of its own kind. But for, you know, the typical viewer like me, I will be very open about it and honest about it with my own opinion. I'll say I will give it a fair 6.5 out of 10. Now, as of July 2024, there is a sequel that has been announced at the San Diego Comic-Con convention. So yes, whether you've seen this movie or not, there is a sequel that is going to be in production here soon. So hopefully, maybe it'll be a little bit more better. Maybe it'll be a little more backstory. Maybe we'll see the character rise once again and kill more people, even more grotesque way than before. Because usually the sequels, when it comes to slasher films, they usually try to up the ante. They always do. So hopefully, you know, we will definitely get to see that here in the near future. So guys, what did you think about today's feature? Did you see the movie In a Violent Nature? Let us know down in the comment section what are your thoughts and feelings on this movie. Also guys, we would like to thank you for joining us today for today's episode of Cinemacast. If you guys have yet to do so, hit that like, subscribe button down below. Check us out on our other streaming platforms as well. And if you're on Discord, like I said earlier, Join us on Discord for updates and such. And also, guys, once again, thank you for joining us today for today's feature, In a Violent Nature. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. And until next time, we will catch you right back here at the cinema.